Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Wednesday. We are halfway through the week, and you are tuned in to Go Beyond. My name is Alyssa Robinson. I am the digital strategist here at Trietsch, and I am here with Reverend Daniel Humbert, our senior pastor, and we are going to be talking about James chapter 4 today, and we're really going to challenge it. And I know he's already brought it up with me. I had some really tough questions today that I don't know if you were curious about, but I am too. Maybe it'll spark some of your curiosity and you'll have some questions for us. But just as a reminder, as we are having this conversation, if you are watching us on Facebook, feel free to jump in and comment and ask questions because I do monitor it. I see the comments that you're posting, and I'm happy to jump in with extra questions and really put Daniel on the spot. So this week in James, it was all about godliness versus worldliness. And I think that can be a really tough topic, especially in Western culture. We like to try and take our faith and make it work for the culture that we live in. But that's just not always the case. The puzzle piece doesn't always fit. So my very first question today is, isn't competition at the root of capitalism and the culture that we live in? Because one of the things James mentioned, and Daniel, you mentioned in your sermon, is we have to quit with the competitive nature, with the competition between each other. And my follow-up question is, were Jesus and James socialists or communist?
Yeah, so let's just go superficial right now, right? No. Um, yeah, so, I want to challenge the question, first of all, and that is, I believe that competition is a characteristic of capitalism, but I don't think it's at the core of capitalism. I mean, the core of capitalism is private ownership, right? Private ownership drives capitalism. One can clearly argue that competition is a huge component of that, but I'm not sure or a characteristic of that. I'm not sure it's at the core. It clearly helps drive it. And it causes the consternation that I was pointing out in the message, which was, man, when sometimes competition drives envy, and envy was the real issue that James was trying to address. And that's where, as you've pointed out already, that man, culture often is in conflict with our Christian faith. It is fascinating if you've had the privileges I have had to go to various countries across the world where Christianity is, and you see how Christianity is lived out in very different ways. And in non-capitalistic countries, it's lived out in a very different way. And in some regards, it has to do with that competition and some of that lack of drive, if you will, that sort of causes me to want more. And with regard to Christianity, that's a problem, right? Because wanting more can sometimes get in the way of justice. It can sometimes get in the way of helping our neighbor, loving our neighbor, because we are driven by those things, the competition or the envy, versus the actual desire and purpose of loving our neighbor. As for socialism and Jesus, obviously socialism is a much more common, or not common, much more modern concept than Jesus. But one could clearly argue that in the early church, because the book of Acts describes it in chapter 2 and in chapter 4, that the early church had socialistic tendencies, right? That is to say, sharing common property, taking care of one another, sharing all of our burdens as well as our common alignments. And so the early church clearly was practicing a form that was not capitalistic. And it, again, we're not going to get into judgments here, just this recognition that capitalism is a very modern concept, as is socialism. And Jesus and James and John and all the others had no concept of any of these economic practices. But it's clear that in the scriptures, there was a sense of, man, we need to pool our resources and we need to share what we have. Absolutely.
Well, and one of the things that James seems to bring up, not just in chapter 4, but in previous chapters as well, is selfish ambition. And he puts a lot of emphasis on how we should not be driven by our selfish ambition. And one of the things that he mentions is he kind of calls us out and says, you are using your selfish ambition to wage war on other people. So when he's talking about waging war, obviously, as a country, we have waged war. Almost every other country, except for the neutral ones, at some point have waged war. So, is it okay to wage war to fight for justice? Or do you think that it's always selfish ambition in disguise?
Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of two concepts going on here. One is James is using language of wage war, but he's not talking about nations waging war. He's talking about individuals waging war on each other. And so James is not talking about the global picture here. He's talking about in the local church, when you guys are envying one another or envying one another's behavior, you're waging war on each other. And he would sort of basically also identify that you're waging war on yourself and on your faith when you do that. So he's not talking about the war that you may be referencing in the question. Now, alternatively, with regard to the question, everybody's different. I subscribe to what is commonly known as the just war theory. That is to say that there are circumstances, as extenuating as they may be, when war is justified. And one of those is when we believe that that a justice is being portrayed, and World War II is one of those examples. When the Nazis were, killing people for no good reason and putting people to death and concentration camps, that was an injustice. And so America and other nations said, then we have the just theory to enter into a war with you because you are causing so much harm, so much damage, that we've got to stop that. That's just war theory. Now, we as a country, and certainly many other countries, have entered into war for much less reason, and that would be a concern that seems a little more selfish. I won't go into which wars that might apply to, but clearly we've entered into wars that seem much more about our self-interest as a nation than it did about solving a right or rectifying a wrong. And I think Jesus would clearly argue against that. And we've got to challenge ourselves as people because we want to, again, this is about culture and faith, right? We want to justify our sovereignty. We want to protect others. Our country has many problems, but one of the things we do well is to try to help protect the underdog or help protect those who aren't necessarily able to take care of themselves. And so sometimes we've gone in under the guise of, hey, this is to help this country out. And those are laudable goals, but we've got to wonder, how does that apply to our faith? So,
and that's where this topic confuses me a little bit, because I can get behind the notion of the just war theory as a theory, but in practice, can there be a just war when there are so many individual motives and ambitions behind it as a collective group? It is not, it's just really, it gets confusing for me, and it's hard for me to justify anything where we are, because what we tend to do is, if World War II is an example, yes, the atrocities were completely wrong and that should be stopped, and we needed to band together with other nations to stop this. But then we also vilified all of Germany for decades and decades and decades. And so there are these after effects of our humanity. What we tend to do when we go into those war situations is we say, you are no longer an individual, you are a collective community, and all of you are bad people and should be, stopped.
Yeah, I mean, that's a part of our human condition, isn't it? I mean, a part of our human condition is it's hard for me to be at war with you and even then win the war and then not think ill of you. I mean, after all, we were in a war, right? So part of the human condition is that it's hard to sort of eradicate that even after it's over. Yeah, it's hard. And I maintain, that's just me, that just like Jesus said, the poor will always be with you, I think war will always be with us because of the human condition. We are sinful people, and we always have some form of a selfish ambition, something that's driving us towards something we want, whatever that is. And it does get in the way. It is a part of our human frailty. Absolutely.
Well, and that kind of takes me into the next question about idols, because I think that you had kind of mentioned some of the things that we least expect, we are turning into idols, like politics or opinions or whatever it is. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that you've caught yourself turning into an idol in your life?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I mentioned a simple one, and that was the nice homes that we were looking at. That's kind of the setup, and that I struggle with that all the time. I want nicer things, bigger things, and I often struggle with that in our home about, golly, what is enough, right? And so that's the first thing. But I'll own, just like many other people, I, one of the things I realized in the beginning of COVID was how much I idolized the church, that is, say, the building, and the need to be in it, and the need to conduct worship in it. And then I realized, obviously, pretty quickly, golly, we can worship without the building. We can do faith without the building. But there was a real sense of idolization there. And then finally, I just sort of caution all of us during this season leading up to a national election that we all tend to idolize partisanship. We all tend to idolize either the party that we align with or the concepts of platforms. And I don't mean to say that that's unimportant stuff. I just mean if we're people of faith, if we're people that follow Christ, then the kingdoms of this world are lower than Jesus. They are lower than the kingdom of God. And sometimes we lift them above the kingdom of God. And we all need to caution ourselves so that when we are either watching conventions or canvassing for the politics or whatever, it's not that we shouldn't have opinions. It's that we need to check ourselves with regard to how important we make those things. And it's on simple levels, like if just with regard to social media, if I'm posting more about my political views than my view of faith, I'm probably idolizing politics. If I'm posting more about how I believe certain things need to happen in this country specifically, like how how the flag is treated or anything like that, more than I'm talking about the importance of loving my neighbor, I'm probably idolizing the flag, right? I mean, and so we just need to caution ourselves on that. And we all can fall prey. I mean, I can fall prey to any of that stuff.
Well, and when you were describing that in the sermon on Sunday, you were talking about your problem with idolizing houses, or you would see something that you want, and for you it was the root of envy. But a lot of what you were describing with politics and things like that sounded more like arrogance or intolerance to me. Is there a connection between those two things? Because uh, I'm I was struggling. I was with you in the beginning of like, yeah, envy is a problem, but then some of the other idols that you were naming just felt like, my way is better than your way.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a connection. And I will also own that, in a, 15 to 18-minute message, you can't get everything across. There are two primary issues, envy and idolization, and they too have sort of cross-pollination, but they're not the same thing. I can envy something that I don't necessarily idolize, but I'm pretty convinced I can't idolize something unless I've envied something in relationship to it. But yeah, there is a certain sense of arrogance, but idolization simply means I've placed something, whatever it is, a behavior, an attitude, or an object above God. That's what it means. I mean, that's what the second commandment's all about. Have no idols before me. That just means place nothing above your allegiance, if you will, to God. Place nothing above your commitment to God. And we're all guilty of that, whether it's our time, whether it's our perceptions about stuff. And so the arrogance that you point out, I think, is the sinful nature. I'm arrogant to think that I can make that thing more important than God. or I'm arrogant to believe that I can make something somehow, even sort of unconsciously, more important to me and my values than to God. And that's both arrogance and sin, because arrogance is a sin. Tough stuff.
Well, yeah. Tough questions today. Fortunately for you, that's all we have time for. But I'll come up with more tough questions next week. And I want to invite y'all to join us on Friday at 12:30 as we have another episode of Go Beyond. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about the spiritual health assessment that everybody's been buzzing about that we have coming up. And honestly, I'm going to challenge it a little bit. And so Daniel's going to get, normally Fridays, we like to take a break, do some prayer, a song, meditation. But I think I'm going to come back with another challenge this week. So join us.
You.
Yeah, Daniel's going to challenge me. So we're going to turn the tables a little bit. So I hope that you will join us at 12:30 right here, wherever you're watching. And remember, you can catch all previous episodes at tmumc.org/go beyond.